I'm Maria DeRosa, and I'm the Interim Dean of Science at Carleton University, as well as a professor in the chemistry department. While today's event is on a virtual platform, I would like to begin by acknowledging that Carleton's campus is on the traditional, unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Ottawa is home to many Indigenous peoples and communities who represent other diverse, distinct, and autonomous Indigenous nations. The Carleton community recognizes the continued responsibilities it holds as individuals and as representatives of an educational institution towards engaging in active reconciliation. Now, on behalf of our community in the Faculty of Science, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Science and Sustainability. Over the next hour and a half, you will get to know our panelists, a group of award-winning science professors, researchers, and students, and discover how they and other members of our community are actively addressing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, namely zero hunger, good health and well-being, and climate action. We are proud to be co-hosting tonight's event with Carleton's Office of Undergraduate Recruitment. Recognizing that we have some high school students, prospective graduate students, and parents joining us this evening, I'd like to extend a warm hello to those who are attending with questions relating to programs and admissions. Carleton University empowers its science students in our diverse programs to make an impact locally and globally, and we hope to showcase these things tonight. Some of these connections between our programs and sustainability may surprise and inspire you. For example, chemistry, biochemistry, and nanoscience students in my research group have developed a smart fertilizer that blocks the environmental release of a fertilizer nutrient until it receives a signal from the crop that it is in need of those nutrients. This may allow us to feed more people with less environmental impact. You're going to hear more examples of how our programs can launch you on your path in sustainability, and we welcome the opportunity to continue these discussions with you after the event, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That said, we have a fulsome agenda for this evening, and we anticipate a deep and rich conversation. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to Kim Helmans, Associate Dean of Science for Recruitment and Retention and Neuroscience Professor, who will introduce our panelists and kick things off. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dean DeRosa. So I'd like to echo the opening comments and to say how delighted I am that you're all here to join us here in this space tonight. I know time is of the essence. We're all potentially a little bit tapped out from screens, but trust me when I tell you we have a stellar lineup tonight, and you're going to hear some really exciting comments, words, wisdom, and hear all about the research and teaching that's happening at Carleton University. So before we turn our attention to the first of our United Nations Sustainability Goals, I'd like to set the stage a bit by providing a definition of what sustainability is as it relates to those United Nations Development Goals. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action adopted in 2015 to promote global prosperity while protecting the planet. More important than ever, these goals provide a critical foundation for a COVID-19 recovery plan. Again, as Dean DeRosa mentioned, our hope this evening is that you come away with insight and an understanding of how current scientific research at Carleton is actively addressing these issues and discovering solutions that will create a positive impact for people and our planet, how students studying science at Carleton can participate and contribute to this research, and we have some students here today that will talk to you about their contribution in the space, how program selection and coursework further educate students about these global plans and strategies, and finally, how these studies can open doors for students when entering the workforce. So you're going to hear a little bit about career opportunities following postgraduate degree programs. By way of housekeeping, before we begin, I'd like to invite everyone to add questions to the Q&A queue, and you'll see the selection icon for this at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer all the questions at the conclusion of the presentations, and if by chance we're not able to respond live, please know we will address all these questions and provide a written response in the transcript that will accompany the recording of tonight's presentation. And with that, as I mentioned, we'll now begin with a conversation about just some of the research being undertaken at Carleton that's contributing towards Sustainable Development Goal of climate action. And so here to discuss this, I'll introduce our panelists discussing the development goal of climate action, and starting with Professor Stephen Cook. He's a Canada Research Professor in the Institute of Environmental and Interdisciplinary Sciences, as well as the Department of Biology. He's also here to talk about one of the programs that's housed within the Institute, which is the Interdisciplinary Science and Practice. We've also got Heath Mcmillan, who is a professor in the Department of Biology, Tim Patterson, professor of geology in the Department of Earth Sciences, Nawaf Assar, a research associate as well in the Department of Earth Sciences, and finally Tara Lapine, who's a research technician, also a teaching assistant, and is a member of the Fish Ecology and Conservation Physiology Lab, otherwise known as the Cook Lab. So to start this conversation, I'm going to ask Professor Steve Cook a very basic question that one might see on, let's say, for example, a first-year biology exam. So what exactly is biodiversity, and how is climate change impacting various ecosystems and biodiversity?
Sure. So biodiversity is really about the variation or variety of life. And it can be at a variety of levels. So we can think about genetic diversity. So at the level of the gene, we can think about species diversity. And then, of course, we can think about it at the level of the ecosystem. So when I think about climate change, I like to think about it as the threat multiplier. There's already all sorts of things that that wildlife and plants that live on our planet have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And climate change makes all of those things more challenging. So things like disease. Disease is natural, a natural process in our ecosystems, but those diseases oftentimes are accelerated by climate change. In our lab, we do a fair amount of work on fish. In particular, we've been studying Pacific salmon in the Fraser River for the last decade or so. And one of the things that my students and I have learned is how we see incredible variation. So this year you saw massive flood events. There are other years where we see massive droughts. We see years of really warm temperatures, years of cold temperatures, and all of that is climate change. I know that when we think of climate change, we think of things getting hotter, but in fact, it's about that variability. And so we're really pushing animals to the edge in all of those directions and making plants and animals and making it difficult for them to make a living. So climate change is something that we need to all work on, and there's tons of opportunity for students to get engaged. The problems range from very local to things that are going on in our backyard or even on campus. So trying to figure out how to identify which plants we should be having in our campus gardens and our arboretums, through to thinking about global issues. It's about actually understanding those mechanisms and doing research to understand how variability in temperature influences organisms, but also thinking about how we share messaging with people. Because at the end of the day, it's people that will need to change their behavior, will need to think about how they vote, will think about how they consume. Those are the kinds of things at the end of the day that will influence how we fare in this climate crisis. And all of that is underpinned by science and making sure that we're adopting the best evidence to guide us.
Great, yeah, and I like that you've talked about the focus on people, because we will talk about one of those things, which is food choices, shortly in an upcoming section of this webinar. So thank you,
Absolutely.
Steve. And so next we're going to turn to our colleagues in Earth Sciences. So Tim Patterson, continuing on that theme of biodiversity, can you tell us a little bit about the work you're looking at on how storm intensity, so Steve was talking about these variations in extreme climate, has changed cyanobacteria blooms. Now, give us a little bit more about what that is. I don't think they're good, but I'm gonna take a wild hazard guess on that. But we'd love to hear a little bit more on your work on this issue.
Okay, well, this is very exciting research for us, and it's being done in collaboration with other researchers here at Carleton and beyond, particularly on the panel today. See Dr. David Mcmillan. We're working very closely with him from chemistry. So cyanobacteria, they're also known as blue-green algae. They're microscopic organisms that are found naturally in all sorts of water, including lake environments, and that's where I do most of my research. And in fact, they're always there at some sort of a background level, no matter what lake that you're going to look at. So these organisms, they use sunlight through photosynthesis, and they make their own food. But in order to grow, they also require nutrients from the environments. And under certain circumstances, they end up that they will form blooms. And that's where they can become problematic, is because some types of cyanobacteria can release very dangerous toxins. And this is a lot of the work that David Mcmillan is doing, microcystins and cyanopeptolins. And they can be very dangerous to humans, to pets, to wildlife. And so there's something we really have to pay attention to. So what we're doing is looking at the history of cyanobacteria blooms in New Brunswick, although they're all around the world. And the reason we chose New Brunswick was based sort of on a happy circumstance. Well, I wasn't happy for the people who were there. In 2014, Hurricane Arthur crossed over New Brunswick, and it created a lot of devastation, impacting power was knocked out for weeks at a time, but particularly on lakes, it turned many of them totally brown. It lasted for several weeks. And interestingly, within a short time after that, and particularly the next summer, there were some major blooms that occurred. And lakes that shouldn't have blooms. These are lakes that are known as oligotrophic. These are ones that don't have a lot of natural nutrients in the water column. So what we hypothesized was that Arthur kicked up all the sediment on the lake bottom, which resulted in a fertilization event, and we ended up with these blooms. So then that began, I'm a geologist, and I look at cores from lakes. So we began to try and figure out, well, is there a linkage over time between cyanobacterial blooms and storms? And that led to this collaboration with David Mcmillan. We have techniques in my lab where we can detect storm signals, and now we're working closely together with his group to see, well, do we see cyanobacteria blooms at the same time? New Brunswick also is very interesting in that there's a long tradition there of measuring the date that ice disappears in the spring, ice out. So citizen scientists and people since the late 19th century have done this. And so this open water seasons also impact cyanobacteria blooms as well. So we're looking at this open water systems, or how long open water seasons are, storms and so on, to try and see if there's any sort of trends and cycles in cyanobacteria blooms. And that's going to be really helpful because lakes are such an important recreational resource. People living on these lakes, they have their houses and cottages there. They like to go fishing. Steve Cook could tell us all about that and so on, but that's something that's really, really important. And so we need to understand then, based on baseline information that we can determine about linkages in the past, where we might be going in the future, particularly as a lot of climate models project that we're in for intervals of extreme storminess in that region in the coming decades. So policymakers need that important information.
Fascinating. And I love how you're talking as well about the interdisciplinarity of the work that you're doing. And I really want to emphasize that this is a strength at Carleton, is the number of folks that are working across disciplines. And I truly believe that this is what is needed to solve some of these crises, in particular with climate action, is that we need to be working across disciplines and tapping into the knowledge of our colleagues in order to be tackling some of these really so-called wicked problems. So I'm going to also bring in Nawaf here to this conversation, who's also in earth sciences, which is a fascinating discipline, and in particular, learning a bit about the work that you do with metals of concern, which I didn't know is actually a term. And if you could talk to us a little bit about the research that you're doing related to climate change and the mobility of metals. Why should we care about this? Why is this important?
Absolutely. Well, in terms of my research, it actually focuses on reconstructing past environmental and climatic changes in lakes. I'm particularly interested in lakes that are located near or around mineral resource development operations. And when it comes to the research itself, I use sedimentological, chemical, and biological proxies and techniques to track spatial and temporal changes in concentrations of elements of concern. So these are elements such as metals or metalloids that are found in lake sediments. And of course, I also try to better understand how climate change plays a role in impacting the mobility and the behavior of these elements. So that's a very important aspect of my research. And this particular research is collaborative, it's multidisciplinary. We have collaborations with geological surveys, such as the Geological Survey of Canada, as well as the Northwest Territories Geological Survey, as well as the collaboration with Indigenous communities. And of course, one of the most recent developments in my research includes the integration of an advanced sedimentological technique that is called end-member mixing analysis with time series analysis. These will basically allow me to assess how climate change can impact the process that, or the processes rather, that are responsible for transporting and depositing sediments in lakes, including those elements of concern. Now, coming to the second part of the question, why should we care about elements of concern? Now, these elements can cause serious environmental and ecological as well as health issues, especially when they're found in elevated concentrations in aquatic systems. Now, take for an example, arsenic. Arsenic is a metalloid. It's known for its high toxicity. It's a carcinogen. And in lakes, you can find toxic species of arsenic, including what is known as arsenic 5 and arsenic 3. Now, arsenic 5 is toxic, but it's usually bound to the sediment, elements within the sediment of lakes, while arsenic 3 is more toxic and is found free in the water column or in the pore water within the spaces, making it more dangerous because it's available for biological ingestion. So whether you get more arsenic 3 or arsenic 5 in lakes really depends on many factors, such as redox changes or conditions in the redox, or changes in the redox conditions rather, as well as water temperature and pH conditions. So it's very important to actually know that these conditions are linked to climate change, whether directly or indirectly. And there's an expectation that warmer climates are going to release these elements of concern to the water column as a result, and cause negative impacts to these environments. So that's why it's very important to care about this particular topic and also support research pertaining to environmental assessment and climate change to mitigate these adverse effects.
Fascinating. And as you're talking, I'm hearing elements of chemistry in here. I'm hearing elements of biology. I'm hearing elements of physical geography. So I'd say to any prospective students in the room that are really looking to study in a program that brings in lots of different elements of different science disciplines, earth science is probably a really nice fit, especially if you're interested in studying the impact of things like Tim and Nawaf were discussing about metals and cyanobacteria blooms. I'm sure this is one of many topics in neuroscience, including volcanoes, which is also really cool. We have a volcanologist at Carleton, which is really fascinating. So thank you, Nawaf. And speaking of the student experience, I'm going to turn to our colleague in biology, Heath Mcmillan, because we do know not only do we have research that deals with climate issues and also with issues of diversity, we also have programs that focus in on this, and in particular, we have a concentration in biology in biodiversity. Can you tell us a little bit about what a student would be learning in this program?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So in biology, we have quite a few different programs, and this is one of the ones that's of big interest to a lot of students because of the focus on biodiversity. This is biology with a concentration in biodiversity, natural history, and conservation science. Excuse me. So like many programs in biology, this starts off with a lot of foundational courses that you're taking in first year in biology and chemistry, in potentially mathematics and physics, and then becomes more and more focused on the topic of biodiversity and conservation as you get up into those upper years. So in those early years, again, you're looking at foundations of biology. You're learning about animal structure and function and plant structure and function and microbiology, big topics, big groups of organisms in biology, so that you have a basic understanding of how all of these different organisms work. And then you can start applying that knowledge in the interest of big questions. As you get up into those upper years, you might be taking courses like biogeography. So Principles of Biogeography is a course focused on understanding where organisms live and why they're able to live there, and how do we kind of categorize where things live and how abundant they are. You might be taking courses in evolutionary ecology, understanding how the process of evolution has led to the biodiversity situation that we have ourselves in now, and how changes in the abundance or fitness of different animals or plants or what have you may change with things like climate change and drive changes in biodiversity. I could go on and on about specific courses, but what is important also to recognize in this is that in those upper years, when you're kind of doing these more focused courses, you also have a way more choice. So you have maybe 60 different courses that you're choosing from in that third and fourth year, so you can really focus on the areas that are of most interest to you.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I know that we are moving away from just like the big majors, right? And just, you know, a major in biology. students have an option to kind of really choose a program that's really well suited to their interests, right? You can add minors, you can do concentrations. We have lots of certificates that students can take. We're working on micro credentials. So I think we're really moving towards a model where students have a lot of choice in how the kinds of courses they're taking in their degree, to also riff on that element of interdisciplinarity.
I agree. And that's, one thing I would point out is, yes, there are certain programs that might have keywords that are really interesting to you. But if you're someone who's really interested in conservation, but you're also interested in molecular biology, you can get a degree in molecular biology and still take courses that focus on conservation efforts, right? So you're not, getting yourself stuck into a specific topic by taking that program.
Yeah, and then minor in law, so you can do conservation ecology law or something. Like there's lots of really cool ways to kind of carve a career path through your program selection. So taking it over to the students, I'm going to bring it to Tara Lepine. We have two Taras with us today, and I was really fascinated to hear that in a course that you took in environmental science, you actually wrote a paper with your peers. Now, for those of you that are in the room that are prospective students, what you may want to know is that the main currency of science is publications, right? So these papers it's one of the metrics of success. It's not everything, but to actually have a publication coming out of your undergraduate is a really big deal. So having that under your belt, Tara, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what that paper was about. What skills did you develop? What did you learn when you were writing this paper? And it had to do with climate, right?
Yeah, it did. So the paper that we wrote was actually called on embracing the concept of becoming environmental problem solvers, the trainee perspective on key elements of success, essential skills, and mindset. So in the environmental and interdisciplinary science program, I took a course and it was centered around solving problems. And usually in education, we learn about the problems in the world, but you don't really learn how to solve them. But this course, we actually put that to work. So we didn't just learn about the problems, but we learned how we could fix them and what we as even students could do to even just make small change. So the paper focused mainly on what us as students recognized as being important to becoming an effective problem solver. And we wrote about it in the different skills that we had practiced and learned throughout the course. So it was kind of a cumulative thing to sum up everything that we had done in the course. And we all worked together to generate ideas and different perspectives on a few main topics. And then the prof helped us to put them together and combine our ideas and just make it sound right. So we all got the chance to review the paper and provide our own input, and we actually got to see our work come to light rather than a typical submission where you just submit it and get your grade back and you're done with it. We got to go through the whole process of having our own responses, putting them together and writing a paper and then publishing it and being able to see our names on a paper when we're still in our undergrads. So we also got to see in writing the paper how our peers would answer the questions differently from us and how we would have to combine our answers and what skills they thought were more valuable in problem solving. So the work on the paper alone helped us to open our eyes to different perspectives of kind of tackling problems rather than just seeing what we think the answer would be and being done with it. So, and the paper itself didn't focus on any specific problem or solution. It was more on who a problem solver is and what that looks like to us as a class. And we got to suggest some ideas in that paper for how we thought the education system could be improved to incorporate setting students up for success and giving them skills and what they would need to solve problems, not just giving them the solutions and saying, go do what you think is best. So one main thing that we suggested was adding more interdisciplinary work to programs and making it kind of mandatory so that students would expand what they know and what they learn and be given those different perspectives rather than staying in one line for their whole degree and only learning that perspective. So I think overall as a class, and the paper specifically will be one of the most memorable parts of many of our undergrad careers, definitely, because as you said, it's something that everyone in science wants to do. So, and we not only got to learn content-wise, but we also got to learn skills that will set us up for futures in grad school, careers, everything that you could imagine.
For sure, that's amazing, and I'm hearing a big theme of students as partners here, right? That students are partners in they're not just recipients of our knowledge. They're also playing a role here. They're also experts in the room. They can also provide solutions towards some of these wicked problems, such as climate change. And just a note to say that at Carleton, we have a Students as Partners program where students are paid to work with professors throughout the academic year to help with their course development. We also have programs where students are paid to do research throughout the academic year, including the Dean's Summer Research Internship, which is after your first year of study, students can be eligible to, again, hold a position and do research with a professor of their choosing. So lots of opportunities to get students involved, but having this in a course is absolutely amazing. So congratulations to you and your colleagues, Tara. That's big news. So we're going to end the climate action conversation with bringing it back to Steve, because we can do a lot in terms of research. We can do a lot in terms of preparing our students to tackle these problems. The next step is really mobilizing that knowledge and having that knowledge impact things like policy. So at Carleton, we have an amazing program, the ISAP program, which is new and it's up and coming. And if you could take a moment to describe a little bit about that program and what students are developing in order to be able to translate that science into policy.
Sure, thanks, Kim. So ISAP stands for Interdisciplinary Science and Practice. It is a mouthful, so let's break it down. So you've heard the term interdisciplinary. So that's the idea that we're working, across and between boundaries. And that can be within the sciences. So maybe it's the idea that a biologist is working with a chemist, or a physicist is working with somebody in health sciences. But we also can go beyond that. It might mean a biologist working with somebody in social science to understand the basis for environmental problems and solutions. So it's trying to equip students with a mindset to think and work across boundaries. And then the other side of the ISAP equation is the practice, realizing that, and the Sustainable Development Goals do this so well, laying out all the problems where we need bright, smart folks, lots of creativity to try and solve. And so this isn't an academic exercise. We went out into the community. We talked to folks that were in industry, in government, working in the NGO sector, and said, what do you want? What's the ideal program for you that would, and skills you want to see in the folks that are graduating from university with an undergrad degree? And they said, we love the science. Science is important, it's a foundation, but we also want to see more of those professional skills. We want to see people that are able to take that science and help us to apply it to issues related to healthcare, to the environment, to public policy, and so on. And so a few things. So this program, ISAP, focuses on providing students with a broad base, a foundation in the sciences, not just one science, but the sciences broadly. All the students do take one minor in the sciences. So they have one area where they dig a little bit deeper, but there's all these other courses that round things out. So they learn about science communication. So how do we communicate message broadly with publics, but also with decision makers? So how do we translate and mobilize the knowledge that we have or learn? There's also a component focused on understanding that science policy interface. And you may know Carleton from its being that we're in Ottawa. Not surprisingly, we have really, really good folks that work in our School of Public Policy. And we're able to access that and give our science students access to some of the best minds in the country related to policy development. And then we've got the last component is on the evidence synthesis. So bringing together diverse data sets, different forms of knowledge and ways of knowing. So maybe bringing in that huge stack of papers and that big data set from, that exists in tabular form in a database. And then, wow, we also interviewed some Indigenous leaders to learn their perspective. So how do we weave all of that information together and present it to decision makers in a really lucid way to help them make better decisions. And so at the end of the day, that's what our program is about. It's really preparing that next generation of problem solvers. It is a program where we think our students, and it's a new program, that's why I say we think, we'll have we're 2 years in, so this is something that we're super excited about because we know that this is what employers want. So our students should be employable right out of the door. They should have an advantage relative to their peers at other institutions. And then also, if you're still interested in going the grad student path, you've got that as well. So really, the world is there for you. And all of these professional skills are so in demand today. So I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of science. That's foundational, but it's how we use that science to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. And that's what ISAP is about. But I would also like to say that all of the programs you're hearing about tonight are very much about that application side of things as well. It's about generating new knowledge, being relevant, and helping to solve problems.
Thanks, Steve. And you hit on two big pieces here, which I think are so important right now, which is that science communication piece. More than ever now, we know the importance of communicating good science. The other piece I love that you touched on is the community piece that we have at Carleton, what's called the capital advantage, in that we have tons of organizations that we work with and collaborate with extensively. We have community partners, we have government partners, some of them that are actually at Carleton. And so students and researchers are well positioned to make these kinds of partnerships and actually be able to have influence in the way that this kind of knowledge is mobilized. So thank you. So we're going to move on to our second Sustainable Development Goal, which is zero hunger. And I'm going to keep Steve on the stage. I'm also going to keep Heath on the stage, and we're going to introduce a new speaker who was alluded to earlier, David Mcmillan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry, and he's also here to represent one of our programs at Carleton in the Department of Chemistry, which is the Food Sciences program. Makes sense. We're talking about end hunger, zero hunger. Food sciences really is the space where we can be discussing this topic. So I'm going to bring Steve back in. Just because I think we're going to talk a little bit broadly about food. And this is a term that I've heard more so in the last year than ever before. And I'd love for you to explain it because I think I have an idea of what it is, but I'd love for you to give a little bit more detail, and particularly for our attendees today. But can you talk to us a little bit about food sovereignty? What is food sovereignty? What does that mean? Why is it important in the concept of zero hunger?
Sure, absolutely. And this is the last time you'll hear from me, folks. So we'll be transitioning to some of these other fantastic speakers momentarily. So food sovereignty is basically ensuring that individuals, communities have the rightful access to food that's culturally appropriate, that's nutritious, that's local, and also generated in a way that's ecologically sustainable relative to what you might sort of consider to be the opposite, which would be sort of industrial scale agriculture. And this is something we're starting to see more and more of. And recall, I'm speaking here as somebody that does environmental work. And so the connection here is that our food systems are directly related to our environment. The food waste that we generate and how we grow and harvest foods has really quite extreme impacts on our wildlife, on our ecosystems. And in fact, that was the reason a few years ago, one of the professors in our environmental science department proposed a new course called Food in the Environment. So Professor Sue Aitken designed that course, and it's all about that intersection, realizing that yes, food is something that we all need, we all depend on. So how do we produce foods in ways that are more sustainable, but also looking at it through a social justice lens and a nutritional security lens. And I think this also fits into our own research. So I love fish, no doubt about it, and I love studying biodiversity and trying to protect biodiversity. But when we have rich biodiversity, we also have the opportunity to feed people, to feed communities. And some of the work we've been doing in Thailand with collaborators from Cornell University, I think has really highlighted that. And so there, we're working with communities that have developed these fish conservation areas where they've closed off some areas and called them sanctuaries. And it's the community that's decided where those sanctuaries are. And then they're allowed to fish in others. And this isn't government top down. This is bottom up, community driven. And we're doing some science around that to help understand, for example, where do fish move, how often they're resident within the protected areas versus outside. So again, bridging local knowledge with sort of our traditional Western scientific approach. And sure, you know, I'm interested in it very much from a fish perspective and a biodiversity perspective, but it also connects back to people. And at the end of the day, we're all humans. We all share this planet together, and we all deserve a good, healthy meal at the end of the day.
Thanks, Steve. And your work, this is such important work. I have a colleague that's, I don't know if you guys know Mary Lynn Steckley. She's in the Beacons program, and she does work on food sovereignty in Haiti. And she's seeing some really interesting data where Western foods, so things like cornflakes and white bread, is highly prized relative to more local indigenous food sources, which is actually having the Western food diet is having a more of a negative impact on their well-being, as you can imagine. And so she talks a lot about how even that attitude around indigenous food choices really does impact their well-being, and it really does intersect nicely with the work that you're doing, it sounds like, in Thailand, along the same vein of that, you know, empowerment of food sovereignty and allowing individuals to be making those decisions. The communities should be making those decisions. So thank you for that.
They're win-wins, right? It's a win for biodiversity, and it's a win for people.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And we know nutritionally it's better, right? So, yeah. So now I'm going to turn it over to Heath Mcmillan in biology, who does some really interesting research. And for those of you that watch the Carleton webpage and the news, you may have heard about some of this already. So Heath, there's a lot of conversation as to how our food choices, kind of what I was talking about earlier with Steve, can impact the climate. And I've heard, for example, eating a vegan diet could be the single biggest way to reduce your environmental impact on Earth, because apparently, as some data would suggest, it can reduce your individual carbon footprint by about 73%. But the work that you're doing with your graduate students goes in a whole other dimension of exploring alternative protein sources. So let's hear a little bit about the work with crickets.
Yeah, sure. So I should start off by saying I didn't start off being a food scientist. I was always very interested in how insects interact with their environment, how things like temperature influence insects. And we have a whole bunch of other research focused on things like how insect physiology is affected by temperature. But I got interested when I arrived at Carleton in communicating with a company called Antibiotic Farm. So this is a industry leader in raising insects for food and for feed. So they raise it for human consumption, and they also raise insects for things like feeding fish stocks or feeding chickens and that sort of thing. So indirectly affecting our food supply. And you're right. You know, one of the single biggest things we can do to reduce our carbon footprint is to eat a more plant-focused diet. And just behind that is to eat an insect-focused diet. So insects have been consumed across the globe for centuries. This is not a new thing, but it's often a new thing when we think about it from a very kind of Western-centric perspective. People in Canada and the US are generally very, weirded out by eating insects, but I teach animal biology, and I teach the tree of animals and the phylogeny. And I can tell you that there is not much difference between a shrimp and a cockroach. They may look different, they may feel different to us, but they really are very closely related. But one of them makes us feel a little squirmy, and the other one we're totally fine with eating. So a lot of this is a matter of cultural norms and perspectives, and there's a whole social science aspect to this as well. But what we're doing is we're working with this company right now to try and find ways to grow insects faster, cheaper, and more sustainably. So these crickets that are raised by Antibiotic farms and sold, they're sold as the PC cricket powder, President's Choice. If you're in Canada, you're very familiar with the President's Choice brand. And they raise them on a specific diet. And as insect physiologists, one of the things we can do is we can ask, well, is this the best diet for those? And we can actually break down all the different components in the diet and ask questions about how changing different nutrient ratios in that diet might influence their ability to grow and survive, not only affecting necessarily the sustainability of growing those animals, but also animal welfare. So can we make the crickets have a better life as they're growing up as crickets? And one of the things this is important for is reducing the carbon footprint of raising these insects. So, and also other sustainability aspects. So one thing that they're fed is fish meal, which is a great protein source, but it comes often from bycatch that we catch from ocean collections of fish. So can we feed them a plant-based protein that would, allow them to grow just as well as the fish meal does? And this is one of the questions we're kind of addressing right now.
Hmm. So as you're talking, I'm imagining this, and I have to admit, I've seen the fish, the cricket meal at the superstore, and I walk by and go, who's picking that up? And so, and so again, for those of you may have caught in the Carleton news that we actually had Heath's student Matt Mizzati did a partnership with Carleton Dining, and they actually featured some of this cricket food selections. So I'm curious. I've never tasted it. Can you tell us? What does it taste like?
Are you saying you didn't go to the tasting event, Kim?
I didn't.
What does a cricket taste like? A cricket. Okay, so one of the things I will say is insects are the most diverse organisms or animals on the planet. They're about 75 to 80% of animal diversity is insects. So they taste different depending on which one you eat. And there's so much unexplored, interesting variation out there that we could get into. Crickets specifically taste a little bit. They don't taste exactly like anything you'd be used to necessarily, but they taste, I don't mean you specifically, but people in general, they taste a bit nutty, a little bit of a kind of nutty flavor. And they're often, dried and roasted and ground into that sort of meal, but you can also buy them as like a snack or put into granola bars or that sort of thing. They're often used
like a muffin mix.
Yeah, people use it as an additive like that to add a little bit of protein to whatever they're making. And if you design recipes well, they can be really delicious. One of the things at that tasting event was churros. They had made, the chefs at Carleton had made insect-based churros, and apparently they were delicious. I unfortunately couldn't make it, but I wish Matt could be here because Matt is the champion of this and is, such a great speaker on this topic as well.
I would have tried the churro. I think that there's like a gradation of things that, like baked and sweet and that, like I've seen them in like lollipops.
Yeah. That's often the thing, for most of us, that's the trigger, right? Is seeing the whole animal, seeing all the legs and that sort of thing. But when it's ground into a powder, it's easier to overlook it.
As a neuroscientist, I can tell you that seeing that would activate my insula, which is the region of your brain that codes for disgust. So anyway, we can do a collaboration on this someday.
But what's neat is opinions are changing. This is something that's over time. There's more and more people who are interested in this.
Well, this is why psychology is important in here too, right?
Absolutely.
Psychological perception of this, and that's what we may need to shift in Western society that is not accustomed to eating, like you said. Other cultures, crickets, insects are quite popular, but it's just not in our culture. So may you lead the change. All right, well, let's move over to our colleagues in chemistry. So Dave, welcome. And let's address a little bit more of the issue of food sustainability. And if you can tell us a little bit about, I know there's plenty of colleagues in food scientists that are doing work in this realm, and specifically about using biocontrol measures instead of synthetic pesticides to reduce food waste. What does that mean? Why is that important in terms of sustainability?
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
And no, that's a really good question, Kim. So addressing food sustainability, since about 50% of food is currently wasted, is an important challenge that chemists and food scientists can help with. So members of the Department of Chemistry and the Food Science program are developing new pest management options for farmers to reduce waste and synthetic pesticide applications. So the goal of this work is to find alternatives to these synthetic chemicals, including novel biocontrol agents, to control the growth of microorganisms on crops and during food storage. So looking at this from a pre and post-harvest perspective. So for example, researchers in the Department of Chemistry are collaborating with those at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and we're studying beneficial fungi that naturally occur in fruit-bearing plants, and some specific fungi that grow in these fruit-bearing plants. So think about cranberries, blueberries. They produce compounds that actually inhibit the growth of pests and pathogens of the plant. So you've got this natural chemical ecology that we can take advantage of. So it's really poorly understood at this time. So it's really an exciting place to work.
So the impact of this work will increase yields and reduce food loss, which can have a positive impact on food security and environmental sustainability.
Did you say fungi? Am I saying it wrong?
There's so many different ways to say it. Fungi, fungi.
Okay. So like mushrooms, that kind of thing that's growing on blueberries and
yeah, akin to Heath and his insects. Fungi don't get enough credit. They're really interesting organisms.
Well, I do like me a good mushroom. But are these actually edible, or is this completely different?
I don't think you'd probably.
No.
I wouldn't recommend that. No.
Okay. Okay, I'm going in another route. So, along the same vein, I know there's other colleagues that are addressing food security by increasing the nutritional value of food. Can you talk a little bit about this? I know that there were some tweets last week on exactly this topic, and I thought it was quite fascinating.
Yeah. So there are researchers in the chemistry department and in food science that are focused on food processing waste streams to determine if they have beneficial properties, and also to determine if they are safe for new value-added products. So yes, there are researchers that are looking at proteins and peptides from, let's say, oat bran waste streams, and seeing if they've got antioxidant properties. So could you add these current waste streams to other foods, to increase their nutritional value? There's also some work that we're conducting looking at coffee bean waste products to see if they can be safely added to palatable caffeinated teas, cookies, and bars with a local Ottawa roastery, Happy Goat. So while these byproducts are high in protein, antioxidants, minerals, the roasting process can also generate chemicals that are slightly toxic. So that could be a potential concern. So we need to be able to measure the amounts of these chemicals to determine if they're a risk or not. So the good thing is when we did this work, we determined that the chemicals of potential concern were produced at really low levels. So there's no risk associated with adding these. So the impact of this work would be to determine how much more value can be added to a crop for both, let's say, a farmer or a food producer, and then also reduce organic waste that are generated by these producers.
Fascinating. And is that scalable? Like, could that work be scaled up to, larger roasteries, for example? Or...
Yeah, so that's actually the goal of the roastery that we're working with, is they want to start selling caffeinated teas and cookies and bars that contain this byproduct of the roasting process. So they generate kilograms of it each day. So instead of it contributing to local organic waste, can we use it as in a value-added product? So
amazing.
Working on that right now.
Will we get a discount if we go there? Could I say I'm with science?
It might work. They're pretty nice over there. Worth a shot.
Yeah. For those of you that are not joining from Ottawa, Happy Goat is a great local brew. We've got a few good ones. We also have Bridgehead, which is now on campus. All right. So finishing up this topic, we've talked a little bit about the research in food sciences, and if there's any curious students in the room, food science isn't necessarily something that students would study in high school, for example. So maybe now is the time to talk about our food sciences program. Why is it so special, right? What differentiates our food sciences program from, say, the program at University of Ottawa? What are students learning, and what kinds of careers would they end up in?
Yeah, for sure. So we really do have a unique food science program within the Department of Chemistry at Carleton University. So our program really integrates the natural sciences. So think about chemistry, microbiology, biochemistry, and then some nutrition. So it's pretty standard in the lower years. But then in later years, toxicology, food safety, and policy are emphasized to prepare students for emerging challenges, both in industry and government. So that's where the program really differentiates itself. It's in later years. So another thing that our program focuses on is the analysis of food. So this is a little bit more, it's another differentiator. So we want to be able to focus on the nutrients, the natural toxins, the chemical residues, microorganisms that might end up in our food. So if we are able to understand the composition of food and its impact on human and environmental health, we need this data. We need our students to have these skill sets to be able to assess risk and evaluate food safety policies. So as far as outcomes from the program, over the last 2 years, over 90% or about 90% of the food science graduates secured employment or a graduate studies position within 6 months. So I think that's pretty good. About 1/3 went off to graduate studies within the natural sciences or in policy management, and about a 1/3 each also went off to government and industry. So from the government perspective, we had students end up at Health Canada and the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And these departments and agencies have a role in ensuring that we all have access to safe and nutritious food. And then students or graduates of the program ended up in industry working in product development, such as ensuring meals meet the specific nutritional requirements of those that, let's say, are in a hospital or in a retirement home. So we've got some pretty diverse employment outcomes from the program.
Yes. And did you hear that, parents? Employment, careers, right? This is huge, right? That's a great statistic, 90% achieving either postgraduate studies or employment within 6 months of graduation. That's phenomenal. Thank you, David. Thank you for telling us about food sciences. So we're going to move to our last UN sustainability goal. We're going to welcome some new colleagues to the stage right now to talk about good health and well-being, which is more in line with what I do, the kind of work that I do in neuroscience. So I'm also going to welcome my colleague, Dr. Zachary Patterson, who's an instructor, a teaching faculty member in the Department of Neuroscience. I'm also going to welcome Kristen Connor, who is an associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences. Bruce Mackay will be joining us from the Department of Biology. He's the current chair of the Department of Biology. Sangeeta Murkagar, who's an associate professor in medical physics, and her graduate student, Connor McNairn, who is a candidate in the graduate student in the Department of Physics as well. And finally, another phenomenal undergraduate student, Tara Thatchett, who is finishing her thesis. She's actually my thesis student, her 4th year undergraduate thesis in neuroscience and mental health. So we're going to start right from the beginning. And if you can see Kristen in her background, very well, yep, what do we got there? We got a baby in the uterus, and hopefully I can see a placenta in there because I know Kristen is a placenta scientist. So your work is really focused on the maternal-infant relationship. So we're going to start right from, perinatal, prenatal life, and in particular, how the nutritional status of the mother can impact child development. Can you tell us a little bit more about that impact of early life nutrition on later life health?
Of course, I could talk about this forever, but what we know is that there's a vast amount of evidence that tells us the environments and experiences we encounter before we're born, even before we're conceived, and in those very early years of infancy and childhood, profoundly shape the development and the health path of that child throughout its life. And this is called the developmental origins of health and disease. It's an area of research that a lot of my work is grounded in. And we know specifically that the early nutritional environment is one of the most profound influences on development and health. This work relates to and tackles many of the sustainable development goals, including zero hunger, especially hidden hunger, good health and well-being, as you said, gender equality, and sustainable communities, and more. So what we know, and what might be really interesting for those in the audience today, is that the egg that made you was inside your mother when she was a fetus in your grandmother. So the nutritional environments experienced by your grandmother and your mother, and even those environments experienced by your father, will have imprinted on you in some way. And evidence tells us that malnutrition in all its forms, so undernutrition, right through to overnutrition, that's probably the nutrition most of us experience, that energy dense and nutrient poor foods. Both ends of the spectrum contribute to experiences in early life and increase our risk for non-communicable diseases like obesity and diabetes, but also communicable diseases throughout our life course. And so fundamentally, I think what this means is we need to be aware of these nutritional environments throughout the life course, from preconception, and this applies to both mothers and fathers, and adolescents, boys and girls, long before they're contemplating pregnancy, that very early period in pregnancy when we know that the nutritional requirements of the embryo and the fetus are actually quite small, but nutrition is still important for maternal health and development of the placenta, the most important organ you've ever had, but you no longer have with you. And this influences both the health of the mother and the offspring. And then I think we also have to recognize that what we call now the fourth trimester, the postpartum period, this is a really important time right after pregnancy for early feeding practices, behaviors, acquiring nutrients, and even learning how to learn about flavors. And this window offers us the possibility to potentially correct poor developmental and health paths that have been set during pregnancy or for that fetus. And it even allows us to maintain and optimize course throughout the rest of that individual's life.
That's amazing, and I have such huge respect for this work. I also, I'm not sure if you're aware, I have a background in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. I did a postdoc on this, and recognizing the impact of alcohol crossing the placenta, which is not really, it's an imperfect barrier, and the impact of that on later life development. And what's interesting is in the lab, the control for an alcohol drinking mom is actually you have to pair feed. So you have to, because when mothers are drinking, they don't consume the same number of calories because a lot of their calories are in the form of ethanol. So you have to, there's a whole other area of work looking at how the impact of pair feeding and reduced caloric intake has impacts on stress and later life psychiatric disorders. So it's such a huge piece of that time, which has such long-term consequences, as you said, in generations. So what are some interventions that we know can improve nutritional status and health, particularly in other communities, for example, where we see less access to sustainable foods, for example?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. When we think about programming of development and health, we need to understand that interventions that are acting or applied earlier in life will have the greatest influence and return on investment, both in literal economic terms, but also as well when we consider disease prevention and mitigating disease burden. So you just brought up food security. So we know from a structural level, food security, which includes not just consistent and sustainable access to food, but also high quality foods. This is vital during those key critical windows of life I mentioned, before conception, during pregnancy, postpartum, and in childhood. We also know things like if we can ensure women and girls are nutritionally replete, that is, they're not affected by micronutrient or mineral deficiencies, this can improve their health. It can improve the health when they go into pregnancy. And it can also reduce the incidence of congenital or birth defects like neural tube defects. It can prevent transgenerational transfer of things like iron deficiency and anemia, so from one generation to the next. And ultimately, it just ensures proper growth of the fetus in utero so that it's born at the right time. It's not too small, it's not too big. These phenotypes influence various things from early life, like neurodevelopmental delay, to altered body composition, and then those diseases later on. And then we know interventions that support families in their breastfeeding practices. So we know even the tiniest little bit of breast milk has huge benefits for the development of the gut microbiome of that infant, how it acquires antibodies and other bioactive factors to educate its immune system and promote optimal growth. But overall, I think the easiest answer to your question is that these interventions that work are very context dependent. They're highly individualized because a person's life history is highly individualized and health is highly personalized. So there's not one quick and easy answer that's generalizable to all.
Right, we need to be mindful of culture and socio-demographic, psychosocial factors. But what I'm seeing is a possible collaboration to explore cricket protein. Just kidding. You never know.
You never know.
Right? It could be the solution. So just ending, Kristen, to talk about the wonderful health sciences program that we have here at Carleton. It's very popular. We have lots of students that are entering and interested in this program. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where the health sciences students end up. What kinds of careers do they get into, and a little bit about the research that they can get involved with in your department.
Yeah, so it's an interdisciplinary health sciences program. So students learn everything from fundamental basic science right through to clinical science. And I should say that the UN has declared 2022 as the International Year of Basic Science for Sustainable Development. So anybody coming to Carleton wanting to do science will be right in the thick of what the UN is projecting for really important scientific work in the future. But, you know, going from basic science through to community and population-based science, students in our program learn about biomedical science and determinants of health, environmental determinants of health, the social determinants of health. And as a result, they come out and have gone into various health professions. We have students who are in medicine, dentistry, nursing, pharmacy, veterinary medicine. They also are in law school. Many of them go on to do PhDs in graduate school in various areas related to health sciences. And many are also very interested in public health and health policy. So they work in various sectors, including governmental and non-governmental organizations. And ultimately, I think all of our students will say they've really taken this interdisciplinary health lens and apply it to their post-grad studies or the jobs that they are undertaking as soon as they graduate. So there's a lot to choose from, 5 different concentrations, a lot of research opportunities, and a lot of ways to explore health from a very different lens than other programs provide, not just because it's interdisciplinary, but because of the experiential learning and the early hands-on learning in different ways that we offer our students.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kristen. So I'm going to bring Bruce Mackay to the stage here. And I know, Kristen, you touched a little bit on the impact of nutrition on later life health. And one of the things you mentioned was diabetes. And we do have in the Department of Biology, you know, if we're thinking about health and well-being writ large, going from across the developmental lifespan, from prenatal, postnatal, now into later life health outcomes, we do have some fantastic researchers that study things like diabetes and also cancer. So Bruce, can you talk to us a little bit about the research that's happening in the Department of Biology? I know you're representing some of your colleagues here very, very broadly, but if you could just give us a little taste to whet the appetite, that would be awesome. And just note you are muted. I can see you.
Yes,
yeah, there we go.
I was muted. I've never done that before. So we have lots of faculty members that work in the area of health. In fact, we have a concentration in health sciences in the biology department. One that Dr. Hellmans is referring to is Dr. Jenny Bruin, who runs a laboratory focusing on diabetes and how environmental contaminants affect incidence of diabetes. And she starts right from in utero exposures, exposing pregnant female mice, and understanding how that affects the offspring that are born later, all the way through the adult. And she finds some really fascinating sex-specific differences. So females are more greatly affected than males in some of her experiments, which is really, really remarkable. We also have people working in the field of cancer. I do. Dr. William Wilmore, Dr. Kyle Bigger. We all work in various aspects of cancer biology, understanding various processes as they relate to cancer. And of course, cancer itself is subject to environmental exposures to a number of things, from viruses to chemicals in the environment to endogenous metabolic processes in the body, creation or formation of reactant oxygen species, that kind of thing. So we have a strength in a variety of different areas related to health. This extends as well to antibiotic resistance. Dr. Alex Wong has an antibiotic resistance program. So he uses a variety of approaches to understand the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And this is one of the major problems facing humanity as we go forward and overuse current antibiotics. And I guess go ahead, Kim. I was going to say,
sure,
go ahead.
Yeah.
I think I'll end with that, since I think we're getting short on time.
No problem. And thank you for taking the time to highlight this. I know it's a big job. There's a lot of fantastic colleagues in biology. It's one of our biggest units in science. And as Kristen was saying, there's, her department's quite interdisciplinary, neurosciences as well, and as is biology, in terms of looking at things like from the plants to things like kind of diabetes and in pancreatic cells. So a real beautiful interdisciplinary strength within the department. So I'm going to quickly kind of flip the script a bit and bring Dave Mcmillan back into this conversation, because there's something that the food scientists are doing which is a bit fascinating, and it on the whole it kind of doesn't really look like it's related to health, but really it is. And that's the idea of food fraud. Now, I don't know if maybe you're like my dad, who has a subscription to Consumers Reports, and every once in a while you get something on like, are you really eating, is the sole you're buying, is the haddock you're getting really truly haddock? And this is actually a health issue, is that there is quite a bit of food products that are being marketed as something which is actually not what it is. And if anybody as old as me, you remember there was a whole Seinfeld episode devoted to a guy who was purporting to sell fat-free yogurt, and it actually went into a lab, which was a food science lab, where they were testing whether it had fat in it, which was kind of hilarious, but maybe nobody's old enough to remember that. But anyways, David, tell us a little bit, what is food fraud? What can food scientists do to combat it?
Yes, so food is a highly, highly regulated field, and it's really set up to ensure that we all have access to safe and nutritious food. So when it comes to food fraud, it's maybe not always about safety, but it can be about selling something that's actually not what it's deemed to be, which can be against the law because there's regulations about what constitutes a specific food. So food fraud is something that's becoming more apparent these days. So when we're talking about the food science program here at Carleton University, one of the things that we focus on is the analysis of food. So be it the nutrients, the minerals, the physiochemical properties. So a couple of years ago, one of the examples that I can think of is the CFIA, or the Canadian Food and Inspection Agency, found that about 40% of the olive oil on the market was actually fraudulent. So it was being, so of course, our Dean, Maria De Rosa, would be perhaps very angered by that. So you'd be buying high quality olive oil and it would be just mixed with cheap stuff. So you'd be buying a product that is disingenuous. And another example that I can think of was melamine. So a molecule that's very, very high in nitrogen. So it was being used to supplement or falsify the amount of nitrogen that was supposedly in infant formula and in powdered milk. And this caused some rather adverse health outcomes for especially infants. So it crystallizes in their kidneys. It can be very painful. And I believe there was a number of deaths overseas, not in Canada, but it did make a number of people very, very sick. So food fraud, you want to be able to buy the products that you think you're buying. And it also creeps into food safety.
Thank you. Yeah, those are some pretty startling examples. Thank you for sharing those. So now I'm going to bring physics into the space, and I'm doing this on purpose because when we think about physics, we may not be thinking about health, right? Maybe we are, because we're thinking about X-rays and radiation, but I think it's really important to highlight the biomedical physics stream here at Carleton, and the fact that there's a lot of work actually being done in this space with regard to health. So Sangeeta, given that according to recent statistics, and this is pretty shocking when I went and looked this up, approximately 2 in 5 Canadians will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. Can you tell us a little bit about the optical imaging technique that you're using, which has helped develop new techniques for rapid disease diagnosis and monitoring?
Yes, sure. My lab is in the medical physics stream, and we use lasers, so laser-assisted medical physics and engineering. And since a picture is worth 1,000 words, I will illustrate by using some images. So can I share my screen to just show you a few images? Let me see if I can try.
I'm not sure. We'll have to see if Moira.
I think I should be able to.
Oh, there we go. Look at
okay.
You. Mm-hmm.
All right. So what I'm going to show you here is the current detection techniques, let me see if I can move it this side. There you go. So current detection techniques, most people are familiar with are MRI, ultrasound, and they detect cancer at the late stage. X-rays are also very informative, however, they use harmful radiation. So is there a technique that can detect cancer at an early stage? And that's our goal, to detect to develop such a technique, which is cheap, which could be widely available, and it's easy to use. And this is, of course, because early detection of cancer saves lives. So we use light. So most of the times when you shine light, such as a red laser at a sample, the light which is collected back from the sample is of the same color. So going in red comes out red most of the times. However, a tiny, tiny fraction of the light has actually changed color. And that's because the sample, in this case, it could be the tissue of a person's body. So the sample consists of many different types of molecules, which each has its own vibration frequency, as shown here. And so by looking at the light which comes out, which is of different energies corresponding to different frequencies of vibrations, we can look at these small energy shifted light or different colors of the scattered light and trace it back to the types of molecules that are contained in the sample. So you may say it's a kind of chemical fingerprinting. So you can imagine by moving this laser beam across the tissue from point to point, you can generate a chemical image. So shown here is an image of only the fat molecules in the myelin sheath, which surrounds the nerves. So it's, these white bands are myelin sheaths in the nerves of, it's a rat nerve we are imaging here. So imagine now that you can have such images of only the fats, only the proteins, etc. And by looking at these small differences in the intensity of these differently scattered light, you can detect changes in the tissue, which could be because of cancer. So our goal in my lab is to develop such techniques, which we have developed on the bench. So this is a benchtop microscope, which provides chemical images, but ideally we want to be able to develop such portable light devices, which would allow from bench to bedside detection of cancer at an early stage. So those are some of the advantages of using light for cancer detection.
Wow. This is why it's so awesome to be in university your whole life, because you continue to learn. That's amazing. Thank you for that. I actually got it, and I never took an undergraduate physics course. Shh. So moving to your graduate student, Connor, can you describe a little bit about how research will make a difference in improving radiation therapy for patients?
Sure. So one of the most common treatments for cancer in Canada is radiation therapy. So it's a very important field that is obviously important to help treat patients nationwide. And there are a lot of advancing fields of research and treatment in radiation therapy. And it's not uncommon in these kinds of areas for the radiation to be targeted to very small areas, such as brain tumors. And it's really important when this sort of treatment is going on that the radiation that's exposed to the healthy tissue is minimized, because especially, again, for something, for example, something such as a brain tumor, it could lead to issues for the patient. And some of these areas that we're talking about can be extremely small, like the amount of the area that we might be interested in delivering the radiation to might be as small as 10 by 10 microns, which is a smaller area than the cross section of a hair. So one thing that's, again, as established, is super important is developing methods that are able to, for these radiation treatments, to ensure that they're able to hit these targets. And that's sort of the primary role of medical physicists in radiation treatment, is to develop treatment plans and to, again, make sure that only the area that is targeted to be irradiated is actually irradiated. And one of the tools that's very commonly used by medical physicists is a type of material called a radiochromic film. And to keep it a bit brief, it's essentially how the radiochromic films work is that when they're exposed to radiation, it causes a chemical change within the film, which manifests itself as the films, for example, the ones we've been working with, are a light green, and the more radiation they absorb, the darker blue they turn. So traditionally, you can actually measure how much radiation these films have absorbed using optical scanners that actually measure this change in color for the films. However, in our lab, what we've been sort of working with is using some of the same laser scanning techniques that Sangeeta was talking about. We can actually, because we can measure this chemical fingerprint, we can directly detect these changes in the films. And this allows us to achieve much higher levels of resolution and sensitivity to dose. So this is super, super useful, because it means that, again, not only for emerging fields of treatment such as microbeam therapy or other types of treatment, it's very important to, again, be able to accurately measure those, but for also studying also working with lower doses of radiation as well. So it's super versatile and a very powerful technique being applied to these radiochromic films.
Amazing, very cool. And you mentioned the brain. Obviously, you don't want to go an inch to the left or an inch to the right. You could lose your speech. You could lose your ability to walk or sleep. But also think about abdominal radiation, right? Where we have, this has issues for fertility if you go too close to the gonads, right? So I'm sure this is huge work that will have a really, really like an amazing impact on the health and well-being of Canadians. Thank you, Connor, for describing your work. So we're going to end with my home unit. I'm going to bring Zach up. He's been sitting here patiently waiting to the end, but we're going to go out with a bang, because we're also going to talk about, we've talked about health, physical health. Now we're going to talk about mental health. And so, Zach, I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the research that we're doing related to substance use, mental health, and particularly in university students, which is a pretty topical area right now, given the remote learning conditions in the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is obviously an area that Dr. Helmans and I are both very interested in. We've been doing work in this area around substance use and mental health in our students kind of before the pandemic hit. And as Dr. Helmans alluded to, it's really kind of a topical and very relevant area of interest for us now. So we started looking at this before the pandemic, and then we're very interested in looking at patterns of cannabis use amongst students. Who is using cannabis? How are they using cannabis? What reasons are they using cannabis for? And then how this relates to mental health issues or things like academic success. since the pandemic hit, we've been really interested in looking at how this transition to online learning has affected, substance use amongst our students, both undergraduate students and graduate students alike. We're very focused on our students at Carleton, but we're also launching sort of a pan-Canadian study, kind of looking at this across the country, because certainly this is an issue that we've all been dealing with lately. And I said most recently, some of the findings from our studies have actually been used to start developing like a web-based application or a phone app that allows students to access mental health services and supports much easier. So we're trying to like address some of the barriers that are preventing our students from accessing mental health supports and services. Again, this is particularly relevant as we transition to the online world. And so, yeah, so we're working kind of on an evidence-informed app that will help link students to, more appropriate mental health supports and services over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Zach. I'm wondering if you can sketch out a little bit more about our program. So we are a Department of Neuroscience that's housed within the Faculty of Science, and we have two major programs. One is a neuroscience combined honors with biology. So we have a very much a marrying of courses within the Department of Biology. And then we also have a program called Neuroscience and Mental Health. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through, for any prospective students that are still here, what are those programs like? What do our students learn?
So the Neuroscience and Mental Health program really offers students to learn about the neurobiological underpinnings of neurological disorders or neuropsychiatric diseases, which includes, mental health and mental well-being. So in our introductory courses for both of our programs, we really kind of start with the basics. We start from the ground floor, as I like to say. And so our students will learn about, basic neuroanatomy and the functional units of the brain. So neurons and glia cells, how these cells communicate with each other, how these cells set themselves up into these really, really complex networks that govern, behavior and cognition and all of these really fun things. So we sort of build the foundation of neuroscience knowledge, and that allows us to dive into some of these more advanced topics like anxiety or depression or schizophrenia, and really talk about what is going on in the brain, what happens that results in some of these neuropsychiatric diseases like depression, anxiety, etc. And perhaps most importantly, like, what can we do about it? So we really dive in and look at these issues at a kind of a cellular molecular basis and try to figure out ways that we can help, ways that we can improve, the symptoms or the quality of life for individuals living with these diseases and disorders. So we'll talk about, management options or treatment options where they're applicable. So I guess sort of the highlight reel of these programs, the Neuroscience and Mental Health program offers a lot of freedom and flexibility for our students to kind of tailor their degrees that focus on areas of interest to them. So if you're interested in substance use and addiction, like Kim and I are very interested in, then there's an opportunity to kind of really focus on those topics throughout your degree. And then the combined neuroscience and biology program is really for students who are interested in both neuroscience and biology. So kind of less freedom and flexibility to customize your degree, but you get a really kind of healthy dose of both neuroscience and biology, lots of lab experience, lots of fun things in that program as well. So yeah, I would say those are kind of the strengths of our programs. The neuroscience and mental health allows you, to customize your degree a little bit, and the combined honors program is really a heavy focus on both the neuroscience and the biology.
Thank you very much, Zach. And just a note to say that our students often go into disciplines very similarly to health sciences. We see a good chunk of our students that go on into postgraduate research in neuroscience. A good chunk go on into clinical disciplines, medicine, nursing, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and then another chunk that just go on to do a whole bunch of other amazing things. So we really see some really neat things that our students do. So I'm going to leave the last person, I love ending with a student, because I think it's really, this is our focus. We really are a student-focused faculty. We really put our students front and center. So Tara, welcome to the stage where you're going to get the last question. And I want to end with a question focused on a key element of good health and well-being. And it's really an element of all the UN sustainability goals, which is acknowledging the social determinants of health and elements of EDI that are woven into everything that we do. And I know that is a big focus within our faculty, is really bringing front and center equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And I know the research that you're doing with me is a little bit different, but you're also doing a whole other research project, because you got lots of skills, with one of our biology faculty, in fact, Martha Mullally, and myself, who's in the project, as well as Jenny Bruin and Rowan Thompson from physics. So can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because I think it's fascinating, it's timely. There's a lot that we can be learning about this project that's going to inform the Faculty of Science overall.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to. So hi, everyone. My name is Tara. I'm a fourth year honors neuroscience and mental health student at Carleton, and I'm minoring in biology. So I'm working on a project with Dr. Martha Mullally from the biology department, Dr. Hellmans, and the Biology's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. And our project is actually funded by the Office of the Dean of Science and the iCurious program. And essentially, our project is heavily focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and student well-being. So our project will help us learn more about what faculty members in the Faculty of Sciences' perceptions are about their students' identities and experiences at Carleton. And we'll compare it with how students actually self-identify themselves, while also allowing students to elaborate on their well-being and experiences as science students at Carleton. So what we basically hope from this study is that we'll be able to identify actionable ways to improve EDI initiatives in the Faculty of Science and make our students feel supported and allow them to develop a stronger sense of belonging in our faculty, because it's super important. So as I mentioned earlier, it is extremely important that we make EDI and student well-being a forefront in science, because it will basically help reduce barriers while also encouraging and improving access for students from all walks of life. And that will allow more diverse and rich contributions to the scientific community. And I really just want to end by saying I'm really grateful to the Faculty of Science at Carleton for providing plenty of research opportunities for students like myself, because it helps us gain important skills that we wouldn't really learn inside the classroom. And we get to kind of apply what we learn in the classroom in a research setting. So these are important skills that we get to gain from our degree. So it's really awesome that Carleton allows for that for their students.
Thank you, Tara. And I promise I didn't pay her to say that. That was what a great way of ending. And I think you really encapsulate what we've heard all throughout the evening tonight from all of our faculty members and our students, is really the importance of collaboration. Science is for everybody. We're all here we're here for good. We're here to tackle these big problems together. And I hope that you've all seen tonight what a great space it is to work with these colleagues. I'm really grateful to have this shared energy. I thank all the panelists for their time tonight. I know, again, we're all Zoom fatigued, and I'm really, really appreciative of your time tonight. And I realize that this rich conversation means that we don't have a ton of time for questions, but I am happy to stay here a little bit extra for all our panelists. If you want to stay a little bit longer to answer some questions live, great. If you have to go, I totally understand. And if you have to leave for our attendees, please know that there will be a written transcript of all the questions and the recording that will be available for review. So once again, thank you to everybody. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, Dean DeRosa. Thank you, our attendees, for blessing us with your time in this rich conversation tonight. So I think there are some questions, if we want to take some. So I'm not sure if you want to moderate or pop some of those in.
I can ask some of the questions. We've been answering live on the fly, Kim. Our panelists have been answering all sorts of questions from our attendees, but there are a few that are could be really great open questions for everyone to answer. So the first one, and I see that some people have already started to answer online, but maybe we could take a minute or two. How do you decide what research you will dig into? How do you come across these topics? Did you always do this research? Sorry, so many questions. So maybe, Kim, if you want to pick a couple people just to say, you know, how did you get here, right? How did you decide on these topics?
Well, like, I do think I want to start with some students, right? So maybe Tara Thatchett, can you, like, how did you decide that neuroscience, or how did you decide some of the research that you got involved with? What drove you? And then Tara Lapine, I'd love to hear, you know, your decisions on how you decide, because that's really, you know, it's been a while for me since I made those decisions, but I'm happy.
I would love to talk about that. I have a really interesting experience with research, because I've done research in all different backgrounds, because for me, it took me a long time to really find my niche. So I started off doing typical benchwork science, you know, working with fish models. I used to go to UOttawa, and then I transferred to Carleton. I realized I didn't really like that kind of research. And then I moved on to doing research in science education with Dr. Martha Mullally. And that's kind of when I got my first experience with human research, and seeing how like simple interventions can make a huge impact on a student's life. And that's basically how my research passions started to form. And then I think last year as well, with the whole George Floyd protest, and I think that really brought diversity in science to light. And it brought a lot of conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, which is something I'm super passionate about already. So when Dr. Mullally told me about perhaps doing a project related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, because she was really passionate about it as well, I jumped in and I was super excited to do it. And I'm happy that a lot of faculty members were equally as passionate about it too, and happy to support a student. So that's my experience with research. I'd love to hear what the other Tara says too.
I think you're hitting too on a really important point, is that you can always change your mind.
Yes.
Right. And there's lots of, like, many of us, I bet you if we had time to talk about each and every one of our careers, you would hear from each and every one of our faculty members that it's never a straight line to where we end up. And if you start in science, it's easy to switch within science. So you start in environmental engineering or environmental science, you switch to ISAP, or you start in ISAP, you switch to neuro. It's relatively easy to do that. And I guarantee you, one door opens, several other will open in your wake. And Tara, tell us, what is your career path? Because this is really fascinating to know. What Tara actually is going to be applying into is?
I'm planning on applying to dental school. So very, very different.
Right. So, you know, lots of different paths to getting careers. So Tara Lapine, I'm curious to know what kind of guided your decisions with your choices.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. It takes feeling it out to make your decisions. I also switched programs in my degree and ended up in the environmental science program, and I kind of found what I loved. So that is your first step, kind of finding what you actually want to know more about, rather than just finding something to do research about. And I knew that I wanted to kind of look into the environment and conservation and what we can do to help encourage conservation and make steps for that. And over the summer, I found I love field work. And so that's the path that I'm taking for my research and my future research. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So maybe one more question, Maria, if we have it.
Did you want to see what Connor thought too as a student?
Yeah,
and then awesome.
Yeah. Connor, tell us what because you're a little bit more cured in your master's, right? You're doing your...
Yes, but I can also talk about, because I did my undergrad at Carleton as well, so I can talk about how I got into physics, because I did not actually start at Carleton in the physics program. I started in engineering, and I did a couple of years in engineering and decided it wasn't for me. I had taken a couple of science electives in physics and really enjoyed it, so I decided to switch into physics. And then when I was studying in physics, I met Sangeeta. She was the professor during one of my classes, so she was kind enough to offer me a position to help her with some of her research during my my undergrad, and it sort of just went from there. So I guess the general thing I can say is that if you're a new student, just expand your horizons a bit with your classes and your electives. And if you find that you're really enjoying something in an elective you took, it might be worth considering as something that might be worth pursuing as well.
Absolutely, common thread there. Keep kind of opening doors, right? And I'm sure Sangeeta, while you say that you're grateful, I'm sure she's grateful for you too, right? Because this is the thing, is that when you've got amazing students, it's a truly fantastic experience to be working with some of the undergrads and grad students at Carleton.
Yes,
okay,
I was
Maria.
very fortunate to get Connor. So.
Right, exactly. One more question, Maria, perhaps?
All right. I think another kind of interesting question, you can you can decide, Kim, how you want to tackle it, but do students from different majors ever work together, right? So they give the example of environmental engineering with biology and chemistry to work together on projects. So maybe folks can talk about, the different types of students who end up in their research labs working together, right? Is it always a clear path? You're a chemist and you only take chemists, right? You're a food scientist, that sort of thing. Maybe that's a way to tackle that one.
Yeah, sure. Does anybody want to speak to that? Because I know in neuro, we will often take biology students. We've taken psychology students. Trying to think of other disciplines. We've had chemistry students as well. Obviously, we have a great collaboration with Maria and Matt Holohan. Anybody want to just quickly take a stab at that question?
We have the same distribution, and I've had students from health sciences, from neuroscience, biochemistry, biology, all in the lab. And to me, it doesn't matter necessarily. They all have different interesting perspectives.
I think
makes for healthy research environment, I think.
Fantastic. Yes, I think that's a great answer. So I think we'll end with that. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate all of this conversation again. Really appreciate your time. For those of you attending, you are always welcome to check out more about Carleton on Carleton's admission homepage. Feel free to reach out. All of our profiles are fairly present on the interwebs, so you're welcome to email anybody directly. I'm sure you can see there's a lot of keen people here willing to answer questions about our programs and our research. So have a wonderful evening. Take care, everybody.